Thank you. Thanks to all of you for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here. I come from a business school background, as David said in his introduction, and we have the sort of norm of if I get past the first slide without a question, it's unusual. So I'm not really used to the 45 minutes, and then we take Q&A. So any point during the presentation, if you want to have some clarifying questions or you want to dig deeper into a point, please feel free to jump in, and I'll adapt to try to get through as much of the material as I can in the time that we have, and then continue the rest in Q&A. Let me just put the context. I'm going to be presenting an overview of this National Science Foundation grant that, as David highlighted, tried to put some hard numbers and data behind the value, the business case for stakeholder engagement. I came to this topic after working for about 5 or 8 years trying to highlight the importance of political risk to multinational firms, highlighting that countries were underestimating the importance of the risk of policy change in places like Indonesia, Philippines, Argentina in the 90s. That the emerging market boom was prone to bust. I drew some attention to a different way of capturing and measuring political institutions, and then showed that multinationals responded to it in their choice of where to enter, how to organize their operations. After running through that and having some success with that, I started developing a reputation for studying political risk management. And it sort of bothered me at some personal level, because I thought, well, I'm not really studying political risk management. I'm studying how firms avoid political risk. So I wanted to come closer to this reputation I developed, which was a topic I was really interested in. So I started spending a lot of time in the field, at the frontier of political risk, looking at industries that don't have a choice. By the virtue of the industry they're in and the locations that they have to go to, have to navigate risky environments. They don't have the privilege or the right to say, you know, I'm not going to go to Congo, or I'm not going to go to Mali. That's where the gold is. And so I learned a great deal from practitioners in the oil and gas, in the mining sector, construction management, sustainable tourism, development, and even the military. And the papers I'm going to be presenting focus on the gold industry. But insight from all of those industries have come together into a book project that David alluded to called Corporate Diplomacy, which is coming out in April, which is a more practitioner-oriented approach to what are best practices in political risk management or stakeholder engagement. I'm happy to talk about that a little bit in the Q&A, or delve more deeply into some of the case study development that I've done, both for Newmont Gold in Ghana, looking at the financial valuation and stakeholder engagement, and also for AngloGold Ashanti across continental Africa. But what I'm going to try to do in the 40-45 minutes with questions is to give you an overview of this NSF-funded proposal, or sorry, funded grant, and the papers that have emerged from it. The first paper tried to get beyond the literature on the financial value for stakeholder engagement or sustainability, which in a nutshell, after 10 or 20 years of coding annual reports and trying to correlate them with financial returns, basically came up with the answer that maybe sustainability pays a little bit for some firms sometimes, but usually it's just managers who are trying to benefit themselves, get free tickets to Davos, get free tickets to the symphony, and we should really be cautious about these kind of sustainability efforts. This is literally where the financial economics literature has taken us. And I just felt this was clearly wrong at some level, and that what we were doing is looking where the light was brightest. We were coding annual reports, looking at corporate level reports of what they were doing, and then looking at aggregate financial returns. We weren't going out into the frontier of political risk and looking at what firms were actually doing and what stakeholders were actually saying, and how that impacted financial and operational performance. So that's what we tried to do in this paper that's now forthcoming. The proofs are available on this SFJ website. We built up a sample of 21 publicly traded companies on the TSX, the population of companies on the TSX that own 1, 2, or 3 mines in emerging markets. And this is the unscientific version of what stakeholder engagement means. You go to Google Images, you type the firm name and stakeholder, and this is the first picture that comes up. So we have Chavez expropriating a mine in Venezuela, giving it to the Russians, taking away the mine from the Canadians. We have some army members here in Vietnam. We have handshakes not far from Goma in the DRC, between the CEO of Banro Corporation and a rebel leader. We have sewing training in Costa Rica, and we have NGO protests against the Gabriel Resources mine in Romania. So this is the sample of the firms that we're going to be looking at. The reason we chose these firms, we wanted to do a deep dive on the way stakeholders perceive them. And we wanted to link that to financial and operational performance. So we needed companies that, unlike the mining majors, when there was a news story about what happens in Venezuela, there's not also a news story from the same company about what's going on in Mongolia, or what's going on in Canada, or what's going on in Utah. If we have 5 news stories on one day, we can never tease out what the impact of any given news story is on the stock price. We wanted companies that were single-purpose entities that only have one mine. So if something happens in Venezuela, that's what people are trading on. We also needed a manageable amount of data to code, because as much as I've been trying to push automated machine language coding, we had to rely on human coding for this project. And so I had 2,500 hours of undergraduate research assistance funded by the US government, hand coding 20,000 newspaper articles. So we really couldn't go much beyond the size of the sample we had. It's literally been 8 years since Lita Narti was a doctoral student and she walked into my office and we outlined this project. And I'm just getting to the point where I can talk about output. So we start with a formula that's probably more familiar to you than most of the people I present to. It's the Cairns and Davis resource valuation model. That, as I understand it, almost everyone learns as they go through their masters in mining. It values a resource based on the average forecast profit, the quantity of gold, in this case, the life expectancy of the gold, and the opportunity cost of capital. And we say these companies, since they're single-purpose entities, and the disclosure requirements on the TSX allow us to extract all this information after some scandals like the Bre-X mine and others in Canada, false reporting of reserves, the TSX really clamped down on reporting requirements. So all this data is available in the quarterly statements. So we should know what the mines are worth, because they only have one mine. There are no intangibles, there's no option value on a future mine. They just have one mine. And we know all the data, so the market capitalization should be equal to the value of the mine. It's nothing else. But it's not. In case after case, the red line is the resource valuation, and the dark blue line is the market capitalization. These companies trade on average at a 78% discount to the value of the gold they ostensibly control. Analysts, and I've talked to them, are looking at the mine and saying, you know, you might have submitted a quarterly statement that says you're going to open the mine in 18 months, and you're going to run it 24/7, 365 days a year for 25 years, but we don't believe you. In fact, we think you'll be late, so the revenue is going to be discounted. And we think you're going to have a lot of problems. Your costs are going to be higher, there are going to be delays, there are going to be disruptions, and so we're going to discount you from the resource valuation. Can we explain how much they discount? What we do is systematically code 50,000 instances in 20,000 newspaper articles in which a stakeholder acts on or speaks about the mine in a way that connotes conflict or cooperation. So here, the chairman of Australian Solomon Golds praises, he's the actor, he praises and thanks, which scores a 3 on a conflict cooperation scale developed in the international relations literature, Ramsey, the regional forces led by your troops, the local police, and the Solomons government. And we do this sentence after sentence, developing dyadic information between a source and a target coded with respect to conflict or cooperation. Another example, the president of Kazakhstan is the actor. He ceremonially kicks off, which is a show of support, the Vardanskoye deposit, which is owned by European Minerals Corporation. We have conflict in the database too. Rebel leader Kabila is the source here. The verb is a threat, ordering or has ordered to negotiate or seek concessions sold is coded as threat. Foreign companies Banro, Mindev, and Barrick. So for each item on the conflict cooperation scale, we have a 20-point scale. Here listed from 0 to 10, I was showing you a recoding from -10 to 10. But we have a range from violent attack with actual or potential intended deaths or serious injury to providing armed support that's risking your life to defend the mine and everything in between. And for each item on the scale, we have a vocabulary. This is the vocabulary just for a +4 on the conflict cooperation scale. And then we do fuzzy matching to take into account different tenses and misspellings that occur in some of the news feeds. And then we develop a conflict cooperation scale. That's what the green line is. And when we look at now the blue line is the discount, the amount by which the gap between the previous red and blue line. So the discount here is 50%, going up to 98%, and it seems to track pretty well stakeholder conflict cooperation. Again, the discount, stakeholder conflict cooperation, it's a good fit. Not only is it a good fit, this paper's punchline is that when you're trying to explain the variation in the market capitalization of these companies, you can only explain 22% of it by looking at variation in the value of the gold they ostensibly control. You explain 2 to 3 times as much by looking at political and social factors. Either the credibility of the national political institutions, which is about half, or the support from individual stakeholders, which is about half. The punchline is politics is twice as important as the value of gold. So that tells us it's important, but when and how and what, that's what we do in subsequent papers. And I'm going to spend most time on the final paper, but let me just spend a little bit on 2 additional papers that we have in process.
So, you know, just
sure.
If you've got questions just on process, sorry, on your stand up so people can hear the question. On your coding, do you rate the intensity of the response? Do you also attempt to give any weighting to the stakeholder themselves? So a statement coming from a government minister relative to a member of the community or an NGO or something, or do you don't differentiate on that?
So it depends in what, it depends where, and we do it different ways. So in our academic work, we rely on the media to tell us how important the minister is relative to an activist. So when the Minister of Mines comes out with a story, it's typically picked up by multiple media sources, it's repeated in the news several times, and so it might occur 20 times in the news in our sample. And so we say it's 20 times as important as a similar criticism that comes from someone who's only mentioned 1 time on page 14 of the next present. Now, in our casework and in our consulting work, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out the power and salience of stakeholders. Asking stakeholders to assess who do they follow, who do they lead, who do they consult, how important is this issue to them, and we come up with weighting schemes based on the effective power of stakeholders. Also calling into attention issues that are particularly important to marginalized stakeholders that could be the source of a rallying of opposition. So the closer we get to an individual mine and an individual case, the more nuanced we try to get. But in the academic work, we just say, okay, we're going to let the media tell us because I don't want to try to get the business if I don't have that kind of stakeholder level data. Next question. Yes, please.
Just a question. That 13 to 33% of other.
Yep.
Have you looked at the actual? Often, I think analysts look at the management and the people that are actually.
Yeah.
Have you tried to do that?
We have a paper that's in early stages, and it probably too simplistic. Again, I think what is that I really appreciate presenting in front of this audience because you're going to push me on all the things I should be studying because you know the industry so well. And at some level, I apologize because I'm probably just going to confirm things that you all already believe to be true. But hopefully, having the academic, the larger data, the larger quantitative studies will still be of interest to you. But I think the best I can do, given the size of the data set, is we've coded the backgrounds of the top management team on all the companies. And my strong prior, hopefully this won't offend based on my interviews and field work, is that the greater the percentage of engineers and lawyers in the top management team, the worse they're going to be at stakeholder engagement. And we're finding some preliminary evidence of that. But there's obviously a lot more in terms of what experience the team has had. Did they previously, another thing I'd love to pick out is if they previously lost $1 billion, because I found once you've lost $1 billion, you really get stakeholder engagement. When you went to the board and said, this many zeros gone, you figure it out. And when you look at the majors, that's why they are where they are. Because of Bougainville, because of Kocha, because of each company has its touchstone moment that they'll never do again. So I'd love to capture that experiential effect. On these small independent companies, I just don't know that I've captured their entire career backgrounds, but I don't know the full history of all the mines they previously worked at. So it would be a big undertaking to code disasters, but I would love to do that. That would be the next step. Do you have other ideas about what I should look for?
I just thought when you were talking to the analysts, they might have said, well, Joe Bloss is, someone I'd back and
yeah, actually the number of managers, because these companies, they tend to rotate. There's a new member of the top management team almost every year on average. So I've got 20 mines over 20 years. That's 400 confirmed years. There's like 2,000 people. So to put a survey, can you tell me which of these 2,000 people are really good? I'd be really worried about doing that.
Just a quick question, simple one. Did you say that you took multiple media, you only took coded news from multimedia sources, or is it just the one source?
No, it's everything that appears on the Factiva database. That's
Okay.
50,000 different sources,
Sure.
including some that are translated from the target language by the BBC.
Okay, I didn't ask that question correctly. So did you take the media item and sort of put a criteria that it has to be more than 2 or 3 saying the same thing, or
No.
just one source? Okay.
No, we just weighted. If it appeared 2 or 3 times,
Yeah.
we coded it. And we also, we use the media weights,
Yeah.
which means if it appears more, we include it more. We also show that our results are robust if we only count each story once. But we get a better fit when we use the media weights.
Yeah.
Okay, so the results hold. So some of this variance, is it 45 or 65%, depends on weighting schemes and things like that.
Okay.
With those new data, is that a purely reporting on the stock price of the company?
Nope.
How,
Well, so we coded things that we called stakeholder events. So that's an instance in which a political, social, or economic actor that has a stake in the mine, they're interested in the mine, they're interested in the outcome, acts on or speaks on the mine or another stakeholder in a way that connotes conflict or cooperation. So stock price of Banro soars doesn't get coded because it's not acting on the mine, it's people buying the stock. Okay, if it says stock of Banro soars because rebel leader agrees to ceasefire, rebel leader agrees to ceasefire is coded, and that becomes a stakeholder event. Okay, but the stock price soars is not something we code. All right. So the second paper looks at the specific instances in which stakeholder engagement really seems to matter, and one of those instances is when you're under attack. So at a moment where Greenpeace comes out and says your mine is going to cause massive damage, you're going to have forcible resettlement of 2,000 villagers, destroying a pristine Transylvanian landscape. If you don't have a strong support from your stakeholders, if you haven't built up stakeholder capital, you get a cascade of negative stories. The government comes back and says, we're not going to make any concessions. The IFC says, we're not going to give you any money. You get this negative cascade because you don't have any political and social capital, and the stakeholders hear the negative story, and it sort of confirms their biases. They say, yeah, we don't like you. We like you even less now. And the stock price, which falls 3.5% the day Greenpeace makes the story, falls another 40% in the subsequent 50 days. Okay, so you get a negative cascade, which affects the stock price. By contrast, 6 years later, when a new management team comes in and undertakes a really sophisticated stakeholder engagement strategy. Yes, Jason?
Quickly, but I'm just wondering, where does expectations come in? So if someone expects a company's going to have terrible earnings, then the announcement of those earnings makes absolutely no difference to the stock price. To what extent, if a company is shocking on stakeholder engagement, a bad event will just not affect it because people expect it?
Well, I mean, you might, I guess our empirical methodology is showing that there are a lot of surprises because we're looking at these events, instances in which a stakeholder moves. So we're looking at negative events, where a stakeholder shifts their opinion or sentiment towards the company by a significant margin. By 2, 3, 4, or 6 points, depending on we do various robustness tests. And we show that the stock market is surprised by that. There is a negative abnormal return that occurs. So maybe some of them, oh yeah, we expected things would get worse, but on average, the stock market is surprised by these negative events. 6 years later, when the company actually undertakes a really sophisticated stakeholder engagement strategy, the economics minister attacks the company, saying, we're going to renegotiate our stake in the project. But the president says, no, this is an important project. The new government says, no, this isn't our government program. The Minister of the Environment says, I'm going to that site and show my support by visiting. Only the Hungarian ambassador, which has always been an opponent of the site due to the BioMaria spill, continues to oppose the mine. And in this case, there's a brief blip downward in stakeholder capital. But then, because of all these positive statements, the rallying behind the company actually leads stakeholder capital to be higher than it was previously, and the stock price is basically unchanged. So stakeholder capital matters the most when you're under attack. It has an insurance value. And we have a lot of econometric analysis that I won't go into, but that's the nutshell of that paper. The next paper says, okay, if stakeholder capital is so important, how do you get it? What do firms do? And again, very quickly, what we're trying to ascertain in this paper is, this is the kind of data we have on each of the mines. Every relationship between the mine, here Banro Corporation and the DRC, and Kabila there, and every other stakeholder in the system, coded with respect to conflict or cooperation. And what we're trying to understand is there are two stakeholders down here, Oxfam and the Jane Goodall Institute. How do they form their first impression? Why is it that they form a positive impression of Bandor Corporation? Can we explain how you form first impressions? And we look at different mechanisms. Maybe the mind reached out to them and did something. Maybe they just read something in the media. Maybe they're reading the same stuff we are. Maybe they're friends like Bandor. Or maybe someone really important to them or in the country. Maybe a more important NGO or a leader or a minister in the country said, we like Bandor. So which of these mechanisms seems to matter the most? Direct contact from the firm is incredibly important. There's something coming out of the media, and surprisingly, and we're still working through these results, this paper is a little bit more of a preliminary stage, but surprisingly we find very little evidence that what your friends think, or what important people in the country think, have an effect once we control for the media stories, which obviously include opinion leaders and some of your peers, and the proactive engagement. So it seems it's direct contact and then your communication strategy are the two most important factors. And that takes us to the final paper where I want to spend the rest of the time. So direct contact matters. What do they do? And what has an impact? We draw on the citizen participation literature because while I think, especially in this community, there's been a great deal of insight about how empowerment, participation builds the social license to operate. I haven't seen from the stakeholder literature as much theoretical development or theoretical anchors for building up a theory of how different types of engagement matter. And so I've drawn on Arnstein, who actually worked in Chicago urban housing projects, developing a scale for how to get owners of apartment buildings and public housing, government-sponsored housing in the US, to feel more vested in the home. And she contrasts approaches that she categorizes as manipulation or therapy, where there's sort of a pretending that the people have voice, but really the local government's making all the decisions, to forms of consultation and discussion, to more partnership and delegated power. And this spoke very, there was a great parallel between this and my interviews with leading practitioners, and I think this might have actually been the context in which I first reached out to David. We did several dozen interviews with people who've spent many more years in the field than we have, saying, what works? What is it that firms are doing that's building support, that's making stakeholders trust them? And there was a real parallel. You got to talk to them, but it's better if it's a two-way communications model. Obviously, CSR activities are important. Doing things matters more than cutting checks. And at the highest level, giving stakeholders some role over monitoring and evaluation. So again, this may be old news to you, but outside of case study work, I haven't seen as much systematic evidence that this scale that a lot of us take for granted, or this hierarchy of engagement, actually plays out and actually impacts stakeholder opinions. And that's what we wanted to test in this paper. So the idea is, as the company gives up control and increases its commitment of resources, time, and dollars, it should get more cooperation from the stakeholders to whom it's engaged in these activities. We also want to contrast activities that are in-kind versus pure cash, and activities that are undertaken unilaterally by the firm versus jointly or unilaterally by the stakeholder, and look at how that makes the opinion. And we're able to do that given our content coding. So I'm going to go through the theory here a little bit more quickly because I think the arguments are probably familiar to you, or the intuition is familiar, and leave more time for Q&A. But basically, announcements are a form of due process. If people don't feel they've been told what's going on and what the plan is, you're not sort of a minimum requirement of having trust. And so we think announcements should matter, and joint announcements, where the stakeholder stands next to the country manager and makes the announcement, should matter more than an announcement just from the mine. Dialogue is more, gives a stronger form of due process. Information exchange makes stakeholders feel that they've been listened to, involved, and engaged. We also build a greater understanding of the stakeholders and can form bonds around common interests, whether it be football or just getting to know stakeholders as people. And it also forms a deeper basis for persuasion. So the more intensive meetings And the greater number of meetings, the more we should expect stakeholder cooperation to increase. CSR payments obviously matter, but one of the interesting points that we want to tease out is, does it make a difference to give $10,000 to build a community center or a hospital or a clinic, or to actually work with the community to do it? A lot of anecdotal evidence that actually rolling up our sleeves and working with people to do something should have a greater impact than just cutting a check to do it. It builds a stronger bond. It's more likely to be driven by stakeholder interests rather than corporate interests. And again, I think this is well-trodden territory for practitioners and people, field researchers. There's also actually laboratory experiments done in US, Asia, and Europe that show that in-kind contributions and distributions tend to be done closer to what's perceived as fair as opposed to what's perceived as efficient. When you give students or managers the task of distributing money, they think much more about efficiency. And when you give them food or tickets or something else that has a monetary value but is a thing, there's much more of an equitable or fair distribution, not focused on merit or efficiency. And so there's both a psychological basis and I think a field and practitioner level basis to expect in-kind payments to matter more. Then doing, as really engaging and doing with the stakeholders. So the more activities, the more joint activities should build up the social license. And again, wide array of practitioner-oriented work and field level work highlighting this. And then finally, the monitoring and evaluation, the highest form of seeding control, when we're actually letting stakeholders assess our environmental plan, monitor how we're doing in terms of employment. That's thought to have the greatest potential impact on their trust, because we're ceding authority and ceding control too. So same data set that I highlighted earlier, coding all these news stories and then hand coding them for both the same conflict cooperation scale we used earlier, and then hand coding them for, is there an announcement, is there a meeting, is there a payment, is there activity, is there monitoring and evaluation, and then various types. We control for the level of voice, the media openness in the country, the degree to which the company actually owns the mine versus other companies where the government owns the mine, where it is in the development process, the gold price, a host of other controls that you might think affect the degree of stakeholder conflict cooperation. I should also note, maybe this is something, a question I get more in the economics audience. In results we're still working with, the results are robust to mine level fixed effects. So this isn't a case that some mines are just easier or better or have a better environment, and so the companies have more cooperative relationships and then things get better. Even if you control, you rip out the sort of mine level mean, and you just look at variation within a mine over time, the results still hold. So the concerns that some readers have about endogeneity, what's driving what the causal link is, in results that aren't in the current version of the paper, those hold up. We're also interested in, for people more from an organizational or psychological background, in the orgs literature, the idea that conflict and cooperation are on a single scale runs against a great deal of literature. In the political science literature, there actually is evidence that unlike positive negative affect, conflict cooperation do fall on a single scale. And in all the other papers we've worked on, we found that conflict and cooperation are on a single scale. But in this paper, we are uncovering much stronger results on cooperation, on increases and decreases in cooperation, than on changes in conflict. So we get results when we treat it as a single scale, but we get much stronger results when we just look at cooperation. Okay, I won't stay there very long. I'll get to questions. So what do we find? This is the economic significance of the results. If you increase, when you increase the number of announcements, or unfortunately monitoring and evaluation, we get very small effects on subsequent level of cooperation with stakeholders. Cash payments, meetings, firm and stakeholder announcements have a small effect. Activities have a larger effect. Joint activities and in-kind payments have the largest effect. and stakeholder-led activities. Activities in which authority has been ceded to the stakeholder to be the prime mover or the prime driver, where we empower stakeholders and allow them to realize their goals, has the largest effect. One of the things we have to explore, I mean, we're frustrated that the monitoring and evaluation hasn't come out higher. One of the things we haven't allowed for yet is that maybe monitoring and evaluation has to be done in conjunction with other things. You can't start with monitoring and evaluation. Right now we're just treating each of these things as independent. You can do announcements, you can do M&E, you can do activity, you can just pick one. And we're looking at the marginal effect of flipping a switch. But maybe this really is a hierarchy, and you can only do monitoring and evaluation after you've had joint activity. And so that might generate different results, and we're exploring that right now.
Could they not also be additive?
That's exactly what we're, yes, I mean, that's the point, is that there's some sort of hierarchy, and so they don't have independent effects. Doing two of them has an additive, you get an added benefit only if you've already done the first one. That's exactly the point that we're trying, and our current specification doesn't allow for that, but we are working on specifications. The problem is, as you can imagine, we have a lot of different things, and the number of permutations gets really complicated. So we can't run all, 1, 2, 3, whatever this is, factorial possible combinations. We have to come up with some way of simplifying it. And maybe, using these preliminary results and saying, okay, there's this, or using the theory and saying, well, there's actually a hierarchy. You can be at level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, would allow us to get those results. It's not quite that clean. So there does seem to be, as you can see, some of the things aren't falling exactly in the right order, and even when we treat them as a hierarchy, the results aren't, they're not strictly additive based on the theory, but we're still exploring what's the right fit. So this is just another way of visualizing the results, the economic significance across the different levels, and then to sum up the findings, and the rest of the time I can take Q&A, and again, I'm happy to talk about the case study or the consulting work if there's interest. What we're finding in this paper is stakeholder-led activities where we empower them and allow them to take the lead in solving their own goals has the highest impact on their subsequent level of cooperation with us. Meetings and announcements matter, but to a lesser degree. In-kind payments matter more than cash payments. And overall, stakeholder-led actions have a stronger effect than firm-level joint actions. So again, I think in this audience, maybe these results are as expected, but I hope you have some ideas or thoughts about how we could improve what we're looking for, what we're exploring, to bring this message out to people who focus more on quantitative analysis and who really want to see the results come out in large end data as opposed to just case studies. I'm trying to bridge that chasm a little bit. People who've been skeptical about stakeholder engagement, who think this is doing well, doing right, being ethical, being moral, but that there isn't a business case. I'm trying to provide hard evidence that the return on these activities is enormous, and that if we do this right, we can deliver projects on time and on budget. And to do that, I need to speak the language of the CFO and the financial economist and the economist. I need to have well-identified empirical results, and I'm hoping that will contribute to this broader project that we're all on to raise the awareness of what constitutes good stakeholder engagement. So, thank you.
Remarkably efficient, Pete. You've still got 20 minutes for questions despite some interruptions. So please, I'll just open it up to the floor for questions or comments.
Please.
Maybe just introduce yourself.
Yeah, look, my name's Glenn Corder, and this is my position with the SASOC, which is usually within the University of Queensland. What about taking that step? I mean, those findings there were really, really interesting, and I think a lot of people would agree with those findings that you had there, but saying, let's take those findings, and I think you alluded to it in the closing statements, and saying, how can we apply that on an emerging mining region or a new mining project? Is that's something I presume you would be thinking, at least thinking about?
Yeah, so I mean, I do have a consultancy called Prima LLC, which provides services, Anglo Ashanti, Rio, others, in which we've gone out into the field, use survey instruments to capture information on how stakeholders perceive the firm, map out the network of relationships among stakeholders, and then provide targeted advice about specific initiatives drawing on this hierarchy that allow, with the aim of improving stakeholder conflict cooperation, which we argue would reduce delays, reduce disruptions, reduce artisanal mining theft. And they've been very well received. AngloGold Ashanti has been our largest client to date on 7 sites across continental Africa over the last 15 months. So I'm definitely trying to bring this out into the field. I also have a practitioner-oriented book called Corporate Diplomacy in Building Reputations and Relationships with External Stakeholders, which tries to highlight best practices and works through both the data, the analytics, and the personal side, drawing on this research. So I see myself, I'm very excited by being both out in the field, speaking to practitioners, speaking to executives in the classroom, and then conducting the large-end research, like leveraging across those different domains. I find it really exciting.
This research, as I understand, is largely based on media and media.
It is.
Have you done any similar research with interviews and coding?
So with one of the nice things about the AngloGold Ashanti research project is we were able to convince their senior executive team, including their general counsel, to give us access to the data that we gathered for research purposes. So we're just conducting the last surveys actually next week in Guinea at the Security mine there. And then we'll have 7 mine sites in 6 countries, social interviews with between 100 and 250 stakeholder organizations at each site, social network data on all sites, and we'll also have our recommendations and subsequent data on whether stakeholder cooperation improved or not. So I'm really excited about the research aspect of that project. For the last year it's been consulting, but the goal is to do both with that. But that I haven't had access to that survey data. Robert Boutellier has published quite a bit of work, including a book drawing on his survey-based research across South America and here in Australia with Leora Black and other countries as well. So I'd encourage you to look at some of Robert's work. I think it's in terms of using survey-based data to provide that kind of insight. We partnered with him when I go to Ashanti, and I really admire his work.
On the mention of Robert, many of you know is associated, has done a lot of work around the concept of social license to operate. How useful do you find social license to operate as an analytical organising concept? Because your presentation hasn't used that, which is a bit of a term of art.
I have a hard time coding the social license data. So we draw heavily on Robert's framework. And for those of you who may be familiar with it or not, let me show you the question. So he captures these 4 different dimensions of the social license. Are there perception of economic benefits? Do the firms conform to expectations just about relationships, kind of basic? Do you listen? Do you respond? Do you engage in due process? Do you do it in a culturally appropriate manner? And do you break down the barrier between us and them? And for each of these constructs, he has a small number of survey items that he's used in different languages with people who are literate, illiterate, different cultural backgrounds, and they seem to be valid instruments. And so I find this an incredibly useful way of once we get outside of media content analysis.
It doesn't code, it's hard to code media.
Yeah, this is really hard to code. So one of the things we're very interested in, and we haven't yet had a client who's been willing to pay for the undergraduate research hours. We keep pitching it to them. But hopefully the machine coding will take off. Actually, some of the work I'm starting now in the construction industry and in upstream energy, including fracking, we're working with an Indian company that seems to have sufficiently reliable automated coding to where we could do some field level surveys of a fracking field and then also look at the media discussion of a fracking field and to look at the correlation between the two. My intuition and ocular validity is that there's a high correlation between the social license score and our media cooperation score, but it would be great to actually have correlation coefficients. I don't have that yet. So I definitely find the social license construct incredibly useful, and more useful in some ways, and the survey tools more useful than the media content analysis. It's just doing the surveys has taken a significant chunk of my last year of my life. And Robert, even more of Robert's time, and we've only got 7 mine sites in 6 countries, and we only have a cross-section. Whereas over 6 or 7 years, for 20 mines, I was able to get 20 years of media data. And so in terms of the empirical analysis, I think this is better, but it's much more time-intensive and much more expensive. And so it's the right thing to do if a firm is making $1 billion bet. The National Science Foundation is not going to fund that kind of research by academics, unfortunately. Please.
In CSRM, we talk a lot about the kind of stakeholder engagement activities and the range in which you could have some tokenistic things, or you could have infrastructure projects. We're talking about empowerment and activities that will engage this notion of empowerment.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about, you mentioned one of the construction projects that is, done with local people. What other kinds of activities are you associating with empowerment there?
Well, I mean, I think I'm going to step outside the media analysis and get closer to some of the case studies I've written and field work I've done. What we try to do in the field, and what I see leading practitioners doing, is helping identify what are the stakeholders' own goals and aspirations for their futures. And then not getting them there, but helping, the classic, teach them to fish, not give them fish, right? I mean, it's helping them realize those goals. So if their goals are improved education or improved infrastructure, connecting them with development agencies, small business empowerment, I mean, anything that can help stakeholders themselves organize to achieve those objectives. It's often, I think the biggest grouping of it is industries not associated with mining. Convincing mining executives that they should be funding plantations, that they should be funding agriculture, it's not intuitive to them. And it gets them into the whole concern about colonial land grabs, which is sweeping across Africa. But I see enormous opportunities for mining companies, which don't provide a lot of jobs, to coordinate with agribusiness development agencies to support small-scale agricultural development around mine sites, and the sort of jobs that creates and the livelihoods it creates. It starts with the realization that you don't need to fly your food into the mine site. You can actually buy it from around the mine. But then you start looking at why the people around the mine aren't selling their agriculture somewhere else. You start helping them break down those barriers to transportation, to sale, to information. So a lot of it is small business development, livelihood support. There's some of it on public goods, education, healthcare. I mean, I think it's the standard. But what you do in each community is a function of what the community prioritizes. That's the first principle that I've seen, and that I really believe in. And then you start devising a plan with the stakeholders based on their existing relationships and capabilities to enable themselves to realize those goals. Is that too high in general, or specific enough, or?
No, I think it's good. I mean, I think that's the space that we talk about a lot here.
Yeah.
But what we also do is sort of think, well, how challenging really is that for also mining practitioners who are perhaps doing that work directly or working with NGOs? I mean, people can identify that their interest is to get a lot of money from the mining company, for example. Yeah. And that's where the tension in suggestions of sustainability, which you said is really important, could be, problematic.
The one thing that I certainly can't get out of the media content analysis, but I resonates very strongly with what you just said. Part of this discussion has to be an honest discussion of what the mining company can't do, and a realization that they're not a bottomless pit of money and resources. It can't always be the case that once we've done one thing, you come back to us and say, we want twice of that, or we want more. There has to be a frank discussion of limits and how far you're willing to go. And sometimes you fall short of getting them to the goalpost. You give them some tools, create some connections, you create some processes, but they have to step up. I mean, the classic example of this that I actually witnessed is in my field research. There was a hotel in Bali that was doing trash pickup around the hotel. And they thought this was a great sustainability initiative. The tourists didn't like the garbage. The garbage was sort of an eyesore. It was also a health hazard, contaminated the water supplies. There's, garbage, foul water everywhere. So they sent the hotel staff every Friday afternoon to walk the blocks around the hotel, picking up all the garbage. Within 2 weeks of initiating this garbage cleanup program, they started noticing that the magnitude of garbage was increasing by an order of magnitude. Everyone was having their entire family bring the garbage and dump it on their front yard. And so and the country manager said, full stop. Hotel manager said, full stop. And he went to the block, sort of the leader on each block, and said, look, we're willing to do this, but it's ridiculous. You come out, walk the line with us, pick up the garbage. You want to pick up your cousin's garbage? Fine, but we need representatives from each block. And the more garbage there is, the more of you we need, because I'm only giving this many people. And they started, you know, on that basis, like, okay, you want in, you got to do something. You got to be out here with us. This isn't a donation, you know, purpose. I mean, it's that kind of frank, just discussion of what we're going to do and what's you know, what's beyond our responsibility and our ability. And that is very hard to tease out this kind of data. But at the field level, a lot of it is setting expectations, setting boundaries, and setting areas of responsibility, so that as you're moving forward towards these goals, there's an understanding that if we don't reap some return on shareholder capital, this isn't going to happen. And the stakeholders actually support the mine being profitable. We want to get to that point. These aren't development agencies. These are, you know, publicly traded companies that need to earn a return to shareholders. And you actually want to get the village elder and the religious leaders to be happy that the mine is profitable, because they recognize that that helps them realize their goals. And it's that frank dialogue that is key at the case level to implementation, and helps avoid some of these spirals of unfulfilled expectations, escalating expectations, and the resentment amongst the mining executives that it never stops.
The same sort of consideration applies to mine closure. I think a lot of mines have signed up to unrealistic closure objectives, and they've been disappointed, the regulators have been disappointed, and the local community's been disappointed because they can't be physically reached. And I think if the local stakeholders, all the stakeholders were engaged in the initial planning process, and realistic closure objectives were actually articulated, they could then be managed.
I completely agree. I think there are different phases of where expectations run off. I mean, at the early stages, you know, the initial team who comes in often promises the world, everybody will be a millionaire. You know, your children will all go to the United States and be rich and send money home. And then they flip it to somebody else, and they come in, and there's no register of commitments. There's no, you know, people are coming back to, well, you promised us a car. You promised us my kid would have a job. You know, you promised that they'd be working for your company back in Salt Lake City. That's another stage where expectations often fly off, and then you have conflict. I've only worked in one case of mine, you know, near-term mine closure, but I'm definitely sympathetic to what you're raising, is that it's a particularly, because it's often so far out in the future and so abstract and hard, and the local communities don't often, they've seen or heard instances in which mine life has been extended, and there's often a discussion by the mine about potential extension. So in the case that I'm working on, we may continue to operate the mine for 20 years, or we may close it in 3 years, and we're not sure. As the price of gold keeps going down, it's looking more likely we're going to close it, because it's not worth the investment to extend it 20 years. But the stakeholders don't hear that increasing likelihood of closure. They keep hearing it could keep going for 20 years, and there's a real problem of expectations brewing on that side. So I think that frankness in communication and expectation setting is also.
So, sorry, we have a bit of an order. So, Diana, you had a question, and then
Yeah. Sorry, thanks for your update.
I had 2 questions.
Oh, I hope they're linked.
They're short. One is, there are cases of conflict with companies. I can think of an example of a company in Latin America that I won't name, where they're being perceived, the government has been perceived as colluding with industry in general. So you can get a lot of supportive statements from the government, but they will only if you conflict with other stakeholders that are very powerful. So how does that take into account? How does you monitor that kind of
So what we try to do is, you know, this is what we come out with through the, actually both in the media content analysis and in the cases. Is there a pen over here? Yeah. So I mean, it's a very common structure that you have, you know, the national government, the company, and you need the formal license. You need to have the property rights to be able to mine. But yeah, whether it's the Ogoni Delta or whether it's a Latin American country, there's often a lot of suspicion between the community and the national government. So what's the natural structure of this relationship? If we've had to form this relationship to get the formal license, and there's a pre-existing negative relationship, you know, this is very likely to be antagonistic, and it's tough to build the trust with the community. So in our network analysis, when we're looking at the dynamics of the network, we look at ways of overcoming that. Because obviously the community isn't a single stakeholder, nor is the national government a single stakeholder. There are dozens of stakeholders within the government and within the community. And we try to look at ways in which, as you treat this as a more complex network, we look at the people you're tied with, the people that are tied to the community, the varying network ties there, and we try to give recommendations about specific agencies. In one case, I have a slide on this. In one case, we identify strong relationships between the National Health Service and the National Police in one of the countries we're working in. Here, the National Health Service. So this is an actual stakeholder network from the survey data that we've done. And the National Health Service is a government agency that's very well regarded in the community level. And the national government, some of the other agencies are not. The National Police, for example, has some hostile ties. So try to spend more of your time working with the National Health Service, which has strong community relations, to help build up trust with the community. So that, I think, in some of the additional papers that we still have going, we're drawing instead of network data drawn from the media. And in our consulting, we definitely draw on this network data a lot to give specific recommendations about who you should work with in the government and in the community to overcome that pre-existing conflict.
Thank you.
Is your second question, only if it's linked otherwise, because we're getting close to 11.
It is, well, this kind of thing.
You would say that, no.
It is to do, so when you read financial valuations of mining companies, a lot of it, aside from the value of the mineral itself, is to do with the quality of management and the capacity to operate in certain environments. So in the models that you run about valuation,
These are single-purpose entities, so that's one of the beauties of looking at these small companies. There are no intangibles. Nobody believes they're going to open mines in the future. They exist to flip the company to a major, and then they're going to be wound down. No one expects these companies to become operating concerns. They all expect to be sold, and that's their goal. Is to get sold. Sorry, who?
Naomi, yeah, and then
Hi.
one more, and then we're...
Thanks
we'll
very much. This is a bit more of a conceptual question, but you did mention that you use the term diplomacy
Yes.
to discuss some of these activities. Do you use that interchangeably with engagement, or do you think diplomacy offers sort of a different link to power and different actors?
I struggled a lot with the title for the book and the framing, and there's certainly communities. Previous titles had stakeholder engagement more prominent, either in the title or in the subtitle. I like the idea of diplomacy because I don't see a huge distinction, and maybe I'll get pushback from you, between strategies to deal with communities and strategies to deal with governments. I actually want to do exactly what the last question thought about, which is the way we deal with governments should be linked to the way we're dealing with the community, and it's important to connect the two and think about the joint strategy, because overall we're trying to win the hearts and minds of the key stakeholders in the community and in the government. And I find the stakeholder engagement term, while the tools and the lessons apply throughout, there's some perception or some association with, more so with the boots on the ground in the community, and less so with governments and international NGOs. And to me, the corporate diplomacy works at all levels. Diplomats are engaging presidents, but they're also in the media winning the hearts and minds of the mass public. And so I found that a frame that resonated more with the broader ambition of this research project. I think the stuff I'm presenting here and the consulting is more closely stakeholder engagement. The book is really trying to make the broader case that the key to unlocking value in emerging markets for multinationals is corporate diplomacy. If you want to do business in China, if you want to do private equity in Brazil, these are the skills you need. And it's not just at the community level, at the site of a project, it's also the national governments and NGOs.
Okay, last question, and then we'll...
Yeah. So I'm not from this specific area, but I used to be an engineer for Honeywell. So they used to do a lot of work in PNG, Papua New Guinea, in mining, and like when we saw, like, it was quite sad, like how mining companies grab stuff from the ground and leave whatever, but we're not really involved, we're just control system guys anyway, right? So we used to talk about this in the bars and stuff, and I guess like with governments...
The local stakeholders probably associated you with some of the stuff that was happening, just because perceptions matter. Go ahead.
Yeah, so like, I guess like you've got a carrot and a stick, right? And you want to go in there, and you want to like, and in essence, you have to bring people to the table, to the party by offering them something good. but you also have to have a stake in case they sort of, don't comply with what you guys originally negotiated and agreed with, right? So like what you've mentioned, you've got governments, you've got stakeholders, you've got local people and stuff. So in terms of your consultancy, what do you actually do? Do you go and reach out to both ends and try to work out how those companies can use media to sort of reduce the likelihood of like conflict occurring, or trying to help all parties out? Like, that's what I'm trying to understand.
I don't like the carrot stick analogy, or whatever it is. I mean, it's sort of like, imagine you're starting dating someone. Well, I got the carrot and the stick.
Okay, move on.
So you're trying to build a relationship. These are personal relationships. So how do you build trust in that relationship? I mean, obviously there are points of giving, and giving contributes more to stronger relationships than taking. But there are also boundaries, and there's also got to be mutual respect, and not walking all over, one side walking all over the other. So how do you get to that point of mutual respect? I think that's where I try to steer the company. And yes, there's a media element to it. There's an understanding of abilities and constraints, what I can do, what I can't do. But not, I really push companies away from the financial metaphor of, okay, we can give them a little more incentive or we can punish them. Because that's a transaction, it's not a relationship. That's a transactional metaphor, not a relationship. I try to push them into thinking about relationships.